Instead of seeing now Egypt and Nubia as two separate entities where they clash at the first cataract and there's conflict, because we're always told from Egyptians that Nubians are wretched, that they were always going into Nubia to dominate Nubia. But actually, we can see that there was a lot of coexistence and cooperation, maybe, and a lot of interaction between these two, which leads to a huge amount of complexity. So specifically at Edfu, I've been studying this Nubian-style pottery, or so-called Nubian-style pottery, which occurs in relative abundance in context from the end of the Middle Kingdom to the very start of the 18th dynasty. We also have some from the late Old Kingdom, but today I want to focus on that sort of second intermediate period, early 18th dynasty phase. So is technology really enough to think of these things as Nubian? So I mentioned earlier that there are parallels for this type of pottery at settlement sites all through the Nile Valley, and as you can see, these pink dots mark where this pottery occurs. But it also occurs at sites north of the First Cataract at Elefantina, at Edfu, at El Kab, at Karnak, at Abydos, at Kahun, and a few other places. So given this wide distribution in Egypt, why do we call this stuff Nubian?
Let's look at some images of ancient Egyptians and also talk about the names that ancient Egyptians were given, especially if they were Nubian. So the first one is Nahesi. It's an interesting word for a couple reasons. One, the man standing there, who is thought to be a Nubian, was named Nahesi. The word Nahesi in ancient Egyptian means Nubian. It was also given to a woman later on who was amongst the lower Egyptians near the Sinai region. She is also thought to be a Nubian, though some people have argued that she's a Canaanite. The female version of this word would be Nehesit. Now, interestingly, this word might not refer necessarily to Nubians in general, but also might be a tribe name that then was applied in general to any Nubian. There are many, many words in ancient Egyptian writings that refer to Nubians, and we have no idea in all cases whether they are referring to Nubians as a tribe or Nubians as a people. If we look at this one image, what we will see is that we have this Nubian man, and right next to him, we have his wife. If his wife is Nubian, then it's interesting that she is painted yellow, and it's interesting that she's given the typical long hair that you sometimes see in Egypt. The people around him as well seem to be Nubian because of the darkness of their skin. Now, I want to stress that even though he was given the name Nahesi, it's more like a title, like this person, the Nahesi, meaning almost like if I said this guy, the Egyptian, and I keep calling him Egyptian. It doesn't mean that his name was that. In fact, we know his name. His name comes across as a typical Nubian. It's Nenu. Nenu the Nahesi.
We are going to talk about this object here called the Stela of Nenu, which is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And it is dedicated to a guy named Nenu, who is described as a Nehesi. Nehesi means Nubian, and is dated to the first intermediate period, which is sort of about 2100 BC-ish. There's a number of stela of the same period in the museum here, which I had a look at today, which was really cool. And on the stela here, Nenu is depicted with his wife, and they are receiving offerings from their children, possibly from attendants also. He's carrying a bow with a quiver of arrows. He's also accompanied by hunting dogs, maybe. So he's
The bow with the quiver of arrows might be a reference to his Nubianness. As we can read here, it says, burial stele of Nubian bowman Nenu, first intermediate period. Now, like I said, it might be a reference to Tasseti symbolically. He might actually be an arrow person. And you notice how he's got this weird thing tied by his waist. That's also a Nubian reference. So this person is referred to as the Nehesi, meaning the Nubian, but then he also has all these Nubian things around him as well.
Presumably an archer. And the important point here is that he's described as a Nehesi, which we know is this generic Egyptian word that we would translate now as Nubian. So let's look at some of the features. So we have here some iconographic features that have denoted or been used to denote Nenu as Nubian. So the first thing we can see is that he is, well, first of all, he's called a Nubian or a Nehesi in the text. He has dark brown skin, which is usually used to, or people usually think of as being something Nubian. He's wearing a sash, which is a Nubian style of dress. He's carrying a bow and arrow, which is something that is also normally associated with Nubians, and also he's accompanied by dogs, which is also something that people think of as associated with Nubian archers and hunters.
The dogs in question are the Basenji. These dogs, of course, come from Central Africa and they are migrated north from Central Africa to Sudan, where the Kordofanian languages are to be found. And from the Kordofanian language, which I will get into another time, they move from the Kordofanian regions, which are half Bantu, half Sudanese, and they move into the Sudanese regions. And from the Sudanese regions, they move into Egypt, which is probably why these dogs, which are called Iwal, are related to the Sudanese people, where we know that some of the Sudanese people were called the Wawat, which we don't know what the name or the origin of it is. We just know that it's Lower Nubia. So to be factual, Lower Nubia back in the day would be Northern Nubia today, which is inside of Egypt. A lot of people associate Nubia with Sudan, but for the most part, when they talk about Nubians, they were talking about people who are located today in Egypt. And yes, they would be associated with dogs because dogs would obviously come from that direction.
But there are also a number of Egyptian features. So the object type itself, a stela, is typically thought of as an Egyptian object, even though there are some types of stela from Nubia from earlier periods. The text is written in Egyptian hieroglyphs. His wife has yellow skin, which generally would be thought of as Egyptian because she's fairer. We won't go into all of the problems of assuming someone's identity because of their skin color. That's a different story.
Because we know that this person is Nubian because of multiple indicators, he is called the Nubian. He's holding a bow, which is typically associated with Tasseti. He's got those dogs from Wawat, and he's got that sash, which I didn't know that's what it was called. There's nothing that would make us assume that his wife is Egyptian, and to assume that she's Egyptian because she's light skinned would be wrong, really. Especially if we consider the fact that his kids are not light skinned. Most of his kids that are portrayed there are dark skinned. What we find is that this is probably the same thing that happened in ancient Egypt. I mean, they do say he's dark here, but let's be honest, he's about the same color as we normally see other ancient Egyptians portrayed. It's just here he is 100% highlighted as a Nubian. His wife, if she is a Nubian, highlights the fact that the yellow skin is probably not factual. It probably has to do with depicting females as divine in some sense, giving them the yellowish glow that gods would get when they are portrayed. As they used to say, yellow is the skin of the gods. Now, it's possible that actually she was actually just lighter in complexion, even if she was Nubian, and that's the end of the story. But I think outside of any other evidence, that would just be making information up, and I'm not a big fan of that. Unfortunately, we don't know anything else about this person. We don't know if he spoke any Nubian languages or if he spoke the ancient Egyptian language. All we know about him is that he's here in Egypt and he is there with his wife, which makes me think what it must have been like for people, especially those Nubians who weren't part of the greater civilization. which I'll get into later, that these people who are Nubians, called Nahesi, is a general term. There were tribes that were naked at the time, and then there are tribes that were fully clothed with sophisticated temples and buildings, and they built some of these stelae inside of their kingdoms as well. You know, even the later ones that would finally put all of Sudan together in order to overwhelm the ancient Egyptians, that would happen. But before that, it was a bunch of tribes. And remember that some of these tribes were in their most tribal state. They were just farmers who had no care about building with buildings. It makes you imagine what it must have been like for them to arrive in Egypt on some kind of mission, being promised prosperity. You arrive in Egypt, you're thinking it's going to be like the rest of Nubia, where there's going to be a big building here and there. There might be some, pyramids. You've probably seen a few of them here and there. But then when you get there, it's nothing but like the biggest pyramid you've ever seen, almost touching the sky. All these giant painted buildings and writings everywhere. It must shock the soul. And remember, we're talking about a time when tribal people would have heard nothing but rumors, not anything sophisticated like watching it on TV, not a drawing, none of that. A drawing, in fact, could not even do justice. I mean, if you look at this picture right here on the screen, some of these jaws are so out of proportion that they seem to be the size of people's heads. So it wouldn't even make sense. You would have to see it. And once you see it, how do you go and explain that when you got there, you saw this triangle coming, almost looking like it's going into the sky, and it's bright white and reflects the sun in certain ways? It's no wonder why we find so many different tribes inside of Egypt. It probably drew a lot of them in, especially after the rumors.
But also the artistic canons. The way that the people are drawn and depicted is following Egyptian style. So the shoulders are drawn frontally, faces in profile, their feet like the walk like an Egyptian type sort of stance. So there's all of these Egyptian features on this object as well. And then we can think about his name first. So we'll think about a few things, but first his name. So his name is Nenu, and we can see that in the detail that I've got here in the box, where it says Nenu the Nehesi. His name is written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, so it is Egyptian, but it's written phonetically, which is not normal for this kind of a name. The word Nenu is spelt in a way that might mean weariness or inertness, which seems like an unusual name to give to a person.
So, of course, for Nenu, the evidence is building, and of course, his name being written oddly, and the fact that his name means something strange in ancient Egyptian, where it wouldn't mean something strange had it been written in a completely different way, tells you the conventional way that the ancient Egyptians would write a name that looks like that, tells you that he must be a foreigner to some degree. Now remember, Nubian doesn't mean racially different than ancient Egyptian, and that's why the indicators are not really skin color. The indicators are not really his height or anything like that. The indicators are cultural things that he's holding and even wearing, and his name.
It would imply that he chose to have himself depicted and described in a certain way, and he wanted himself depicted in a way that is typical for Egyptians. It also implied that he selected the text, and in turn that he was able to speak and perhaps even read Egyptian language. But if we assume the opposite, if we assume that Nenu was Nubian, it suggests that he was maybe bilingual, that he could speak and read Egyptian and Nubian, or not read Nubian because there wasn't a Nubian writing. But maybe he didn't speak Nubian at all. Maybe he's lived in Egypt his whole life and maybe he only spoke Egyptian. So we don't know exactly what was going on there. But
1400 BC, we have another reference to this word under Thutmose I, where he says, their villages to him, kissing the ground, dancing in homage to his majesty, bowing to his Urias after he had overthrown the chief of the Nubians. Then the next phrase, Nahesi Wasur, which is the despoiled Nubians, something his grip, loses his grip. Now, that Wasur word can also mean the brave or anything like that, so it's interesting that they go with despoiled. So, what we know here is that the word Nahesi is 100% used for Nubians. As here, he uses a Nubian word, the STJW word, for Nubians, and then he uses Nahesi. Now, that first word, KSW, is not Kush. I know some people are going to see it and think it. It means bowing. It means bowing. It doesn't mean Kush. But in the bottom line, NHSJ is Nahesi. So we can see here that having a man who's a Nubian being called the Nahesi is striking, especially when we can see in multiple places all over Egypt that the word Nahesi is used over and over and over and over and over again to signify Nubians in specific locations, actually. And again, this word Nahesi is not specific in some ways. In other words, it's specific that it's talking about Nubia, but it's not specific about which Nubians. It just generally means Nubians. In this stele, we actually have something very important, which is they use another word referring to Nubians generally, and it's this STJW word. This word can easily be translated to Nubians, and as you can see, it's identical to the other dictionary definition, Nubians, right there at the bottom. So here he's referring to a specific type of Nubians, even though he says Nubians. And how do I know? Because he says, I have overthrown the chief of the Nubians. This means he has overwhelmed one person. And that's the important part, that these Nubians, whether it's a multiple plural or not, refers to a tribe that was under one person's power. But he then refers to them as Nahesi. So it's possible that there was a confederation of Nubians, and he's talking about how he took out those ones specifically. There are actually more words referring to Nubians, which shows that they had a difference between different Nubians. One of the Nubians were the desert dwelling ones. So let's talk about the faraway tribes of Nubia, the ones that we know were pretty far away from Egypt compared to the other ones. And the way we know this is because one of their traits is that their names are typical of Nilo-Saharan names. So the Iram, right, are a tribe of Nubians who are located in the place where we would call Meroe, and over there, you might find Kush as well being used. And a lot of these Kushites and these Iram, what they have in common is that it's Sudanic all the way. Now, remember that we don't find for a long time a history of names written in Afro-Asiatic outside of ancient Egyptian. But actually, there is Sudanic people, or Nubians if you'd like, which are written in Afro-Asiatic. And those are the ones that are not necessarily Kush and not necessarily Iram, where the capital of the Kushites is in Meroe. For now, let's ignore Punt and let's just go straight to the next sentence. So, in Punt, in the eastern desert, full stop, so that's not the important part, based partly on the analysis of phonology of place names and personal names from the relevant regions preserved in ancient texts. He argues that the terms from Kush and Iram, ancient names for Kerma, and the region south of it, respectively, in Egyptian texts, display traits of typical of Eastern Sudanic languages, while those from further north in Lower Nubia and east are more typical of Afro-Asiatic family, noting the Iram list also provides a similar inventory to Kush, placing this firmly in an Eastern Sudanic zone. These Iram Kush lists are distinctive from the Wawat, which we discussed earlier, the Medjay, which are the people who would be associated with police in Egypt, Nubians, which are associated with police in Egypt, Punt. Remember again, Punt is in Somalia, Ethiopia, and then Wetnet list, which provides sounds typical of Afro-Asiatic languages. Couple things that come up when you think about if this person is correct. Remember, this is a hypothesis; it's not necessarily a fact. Theory, I would say, because if you look at it, the original list, which we don't have time to go through it right now, but if you look at the places that they are given, you would expect Afro-Asiatic languages in those regions. Punt being in Somalia and Ethiopia, where Afro-Asiatic languages are still today. That's interesting because it means that there's early evidence of Afro-Asiatic languages from ancient Egypt. That would be very interesting. And of course, there's also Kordofanian with the implications of Bantu languages there. Medjay, which are located in the northern parts of Nubia, Wawat as well. We would expect those. So remember, there's a double separation. And I want to make sure that people understand this. That area, Sudan, is one of the most crowded in languages. There's the Kordofanian break, there's the Niger Congo languages, there's the Sudanic languages, there's Afro-Asiatic languages in that one region at one time, maybe about 2000 BC. Again, I'll talk about the Kordofanian languages another time because it still hasn't been decided exactly if all the Kordofanian languages are related to Niger Congo languages or if they're separate with borrowings. What it means, though, is that clearly there is a bridge between Sudan, Punt, the Bantu regions, the Niger regions, and that area is Sudan, but it doesn't necessarily take away everything. It's interesting how Punt itself is literally, literally an Afro-Asiatic region as it is today, and perhaps it shows the true history that the Afro-Asiatic languages were so deeply embedded in Africa that they could hop from one place to another. I mean, it's kind of crazy to have Sudan have a whole bunch of Nilo-Saharan languages, and there is some thought that the Nilo-Saharan languages represented more of the people that were away from the rivers, and then the Afro-Asiatic might resemble people who are close to the rivers. Now, that's not necessarily true of all of them, as so many of them have been by the rivers, and there's so many. We talk about thousands of years, but at one time it might have represented that, especially since we have Kerma and all these places.
Wider variety of forms, so we have open forms and closed forms, and the decoration is less common. Nubian stuff is far more decorative. But we need to ask ourselves some questions, though. If we divide it simply like that, we've got Egyptian here and Nubian over there, we can put them in different boxes and end of story. But there are some other things we need to think about. So is technology really enough to think of these things as Nubian? So I mentioned earlier that there are parallels for this type of pottery at settlement sites all through the Nile Valley, and as you can see, these pink dots mark where this pottery occurs. But it also occurs at sites north of the First Cataract at Elefantina, at Edfu, at El Kab, at Karnak, at Abydos, at Kahun, and a few other places. So given this wide distribution in Egypt, why do we call this stuff Nubian? And one thing we consider is where the vessels were produced. Now, unfortunately, we're not able to do things like
Our giveaway is pottery. We know that pottery was invented and then shipped all around the areas, and so we can tell that the Egyptians had moved some of their pottery down to Egypt and some of the Nubian pottery up into the highest parts of Egypt and possibly into Asia, but for the most part they stayed in Egypt, and for the most part the Egyptian pottery stayed in Nubia. And so we know that, but we know also that the other Nubians built pottery exactly the same. The other Sudanese people built pottery exactly the same as the Nubians. And you see this in Meroe, and you see it all over the place. Now remember, the potter's wheel had been invented a long time ago, and that is the one thing that separates a lot of Nubian art or Nubian pottery from Egyptian pottery, that they used the potter's wheel, whereas in Africa, and this is the whole Africa, they used their hands and had various methods, like this method here of using the black top to dry it so that it can keep its shape and everything else like that. So these very technical and skilled people seem to have everything in common with the rest of Africa more than anybody can really say. It's not even known how deep their connection is, especially with the Kordofanians right here in the corner. So let's see the criteria that he gives for Nubian versus Egyptian. Handmade, no turning wheel, red exterior, black interior, black tops, fired at low temperatures, fabric black, soft and crumbly, predominantly bowl forms, incised decorations. And the Egyptian, mostly made of the turning wheel, lighter colored surfaces, fired at higher temperature, fabric well oxidized, well variety of open and closed forms, and decoration less uncommon. Actually, I think that's a mistake because he said decoration less common. He means uncommon. Decoration less, comma, uncommon. So that part kind of confused me. But yeah, he's saying that the Egyptians typically didn't decorate their pottery as much as the Nubians did.
forms, so we have open forms and closed forms, and the decoration is less common. Nubian stuff is far more decorative.
If we look at other people from other places, like these women located uh, to the south of the Nubian regions, all the way down to Ethiopia and places like that, we can see that their pottery uses both the Egyptian and the Nubian. As you can see, some of them are black topped with red bodies, and some of them, obviously, it's not black topped, but it's got the still got the black around it, and it's got this closed gourd thing that he's talking about that the Egyptians did, whereas the Nubians tended to have like dish-like pottery, where their pottery is like fully open. Now, some people always get triggered when I say Afroasiatic. Afroasiatic, as you can see, can mean fully black. Of course, there's other pieces of land located in Africa which we don't know exactly where they are, but we know that they're in the direction of Africa, and this is one of them, probably pronounced Ew, and it is somewhere in Africa. That's why it's written a location on Africa, and it's in the region of the Nubians, but it's not necessarily the people that they would call the Nubians. Possibly it could be one of the other Afroasiatic tribes, or even further than that, representing the Niger Kordofanian languages. Now, before you go around saying that these were the actual names of these places, remember that these words come from the ancient Egyptians, which means they might not represent fully the local languages and what the words meant. Just like how, even close neighbors, like how some people, in Africa, a tribe will be right next to you and you'll have your own name for them. For example, the Khoisan in South African languages before the white people got there were called Umtwa, but that's not their name. And any name that is not related to the original language can't be the name that they gave themselves. And of course, if we look at other names like Xhosa, which is believed to come from the Khoi word for angry man. And, we find so many words that are made up but might not represent fully the words used by those people. And if we can see that in our modern world, in tribes in our modern world, there is very little hope that it didn't happen in the ancient past. Now, there's some that we obviously know come from outside and have nothing to do, words that have nothing to do with tribal names. Next time, we should probably look at Libyan words. For example, what words did people use in ancient Egypt to describe specific tribes in Libya? And are there any tribes that relate to those words today where you look at the word, you go, yes, that makes sense? Now, keep in mind, there's that guy who had that one theory, which I agree with, that half of the people have names that are Afro-Asiatic place names and stuff like that, and then the other had place names that were Sudanic or Nilo-Saharan in origin. This means that it is possible that a lot of those words did come from the natives. So this one people will be very familiar with, but like I said, this one doesn't really represent the ancient Egyptians. But you can see that Libyans had their own words. We will return with the Libyans because we have people like the Shashe, which are Libyans, Libyan tribe that is mentioned, and so many other names. And we will see if they fit into the Afro-Asiatic branch, or are they Libyans living in Libya who speak Nilo-Saharan languages. That would be very interesting if they did, because it would mean that the branch that goes from Afro-Asiatic to Nilo-Saharan is not a smooth one. I know I only used one Nahesi, and which means I used only one Nubian spoken of in person, but this was a general understanding that Nubians were well known in Egypt and they came in various varieties, and they came as far as Meroe, deep in the past 3000 BC, and they were known to visit Egypt and work there and then return home. And sometimes we know that even Egyptians would go and live in Nubia or live in Meroe, Sudan. There's a lot of evidence of that.